Okay, so, like, have you ever just looked around and thought about all the rules and structures that kind of hold our society together? I mean, we've got laws, we've got social groups, even just these unspoken ways we interact. It all feels so, I don't know, established, right? But, like, where did all this stuff come from? What's it all actually made of?
It's a great question, and it's one that philosophers have been grappling with for a long time.
And today, we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating world of social ontology to try and find some answers.
That's right. Social ontology is a branch of philosophy that digs into the very nature of the social world. It's about understanding how things like social facts, institutions, even basic social categories like friend or citizen, how all of this comes into being.
So we're not just talking about like psychology here. We're going deeper, rather.
Exactly. It's not just about what's going on in individual minds. It's about how these minds interact to create something larger than themselves. How do we go from individuals to these complex social realities we all experience?
It's like asking, how is the social world constructed?
You got it. And to guide us through this exploration, we're turning to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, specifically their entry on social ontology. It's a really comprehensive resource. It's going to be our roadmap, so to speak, for this deep dive.
Cool. So where do we even begin?
Well, the Stanford entry lays out two really central questions that social ontology tries to answer. First, there's the question of the constituents of social entities. So when we talk about something like a corporation or a family or a political party, what are the basic building blocks of these things? What are they actually made of?
Right, because we can't just point to a physical object like, oh, there's a corporation, it's that building, it's something more, isn't it?
Exactly. One perspective on this is what's called psychologism. This is the idea that social entities are ultimately reducible to the psychological states of individuals. So think about thinkers like John Stuart Mill or some economists who argue that all social phenomena can be explained in terms of individual beliefs, desires, and actions.
So if you could map out the thoughts and feelings of every person involved in a social thing, you'd basically understand the whole thing.
That's the gist of it. But of course, not everyone agrees with that view. There's a lot of debate about whether psychologism captures the whole picture. I mean, think about something like a university.
Yeah.
Sure, it's made up of individuals, students, professors, staff, but there's also the physical buildings, the libraries, the endowment, all these material things that play a role in what a university is.
Yeah, you can't just have a university with just a bunch of people sitting around talking about ideas. You need all that other stuff too.
Right, and this gets to a broader debate between what's called ontological individualism,
Hmm.
the view that everything in the social world is ultimately built from individuals, and those who argue that, no, there are other things that are equally fundamental, things like material resources or shared practices or maybe even abstract social structures.
Okay, so that's the first big question. What are social things made of? What's the second one?
The second one is about the construction of social categories. This is about how we carve up the social world, how we group and classify things. Things like citizen, friend, enemy, legal, illegal. All these categories we use to understand the social landscape. The question is, how are these categories actually formed? What anchors them?
So, like, my understanding of what a friend is that just something I've come up with on my own, or is there something more shared going on there?
That's exactly the kind of question social ontology asks. And there are a bunch of different theories about how this happens. One idea is that these categories are grounded in individual mental states. So each person might have their own internal mental representation of what friendship means based on their own experiences and beliefs. Thinkers like Quine, with his idea of the web of belief, might fit in here.
Right, like each of us builds up our own mental categories for everything, from birds to planets to, well, friends.
Right. But then there's also the idea that it can't just be about individual minds,
Yeah.
right? Because there's clearly a shared understanding of what these categories mean.
Like, I can't just decide that, someone who's trying to rob me is actually my friend. There's a broader social agreement on what that word means.
Exactly. And that leads us to theories that emphasize community-wide mental states. This
Mhm.
includes the idea that social categories are formed through agreement, shared conventions, or even what philosophers call collective attitudes.
So it's more like a collective agreement, like we all kind of agree to use the word friend in a certain way.
Right. Think about Hume's famous example of promises. A promise isn't just something that happens in one person's head. It relies on a shared understanding of what a promise is and the obligations it entails.
Okay, so it's like a social contract, almost.
In a way, yeah. You also have theories that focus on distributed mental states, where the shared understanding isn't located in any single mind, but is somehow spread across a community.
That's pretty wild.
Hmm.
So we've got individual minds, collective minds. Any other ways these categories get formed?
Oh yeah, there's more. You've also got pattern theories, which focus on the functional roles that
Hmm.
things play in a system. So instead of asking what people are thinking, we ask, what does this thing do?
Interesting.
Yeah, so for example, the philosopher Ruth Millikan talks about teleofunctions, where the meaning of a category is tied to its function, how it's been successfully copied or reproduced, because it serves a specific purpose.
So, like, a heart has the function of pumping blood, so anything that does that we can call a heart.
Exactly. And you also have theories that focus on causal loops and homeostasis, the idea that categories are maintained by certain stable patterns of cause and effect. Think about the category disease it persists, because instances of disease share certain causal mechanisms that disrupt normal biological functioning. Could social categories also be understood this way?
I see. So, instead of focusing on shared ideas, these theories look at shared roles or functions. What else is there?
Well, we can't forget about theories of practice. These emphasize how our actual engagement with the world, our repeated actions and interactions, shape the categories we use.
So, it's like by doing things together, we kind of reinforce the categories themselves.
Exactly. Think about Giddens' concept of structuration, where social structures are both produced by and shape our actions. Or Bourdieu's idea of habitus, these deeply ingrained habits and dispositions that influence how we perceive and act in the world.
So, like, by participating in a market economy, by buying and selling, I'm not just acting within the market, I'm also helping to create the market.
Exactly. And then there are pluralistic or heterogeneous theories. These suggest that there's not just one way that social categories are formed. They can be anchored in multiple ways. Individual mental states, shared agreements, functional roles, practices, all mixed together.
So, it's not an either, it's more like a yes and.
Pretty much. And of course, we can't ignore the huge role that language plays in all of this. The very words we use, the meanings we attach to them, the way we use language to create and reinforce social distinctions. All of this is central to how social categories are constructed. Thinkers like Wittgenstein, Foucault, and Butler have all explored this in depth.
Yeah, it's like language is the tool we use to actually build these social realities.
Precisely. And, this whole idea that parts of the world, the social world specifically, are made by us, not just given this isn't a new idea.
Oh, really?
Yeah, philosophers have been wrestling with this for centuries. Think back to the ancient Greek sophists who were debating the distinction between physis, nature, and nomos, custom or convention. They were already asking, are things like justice, law, even language itself, are these grounded in some natural order, or are they simply based on human agreement?
So those early philosophers were already like grappling with the idea of social construction.
They were. And then in the early modern period, you have thinkers like Filmer arguing for the divine right of kings, grounding political authority in a natural family model. And then you have Locke coming along and challenging that, arguing that state authority comes from the natural rights of individuals.
So different ideas about where social structures come from, different sources of the social order.
Right. But a key shift that happened around the 18th century was a move towards thinking about the constituents of social entities. Instead of just asking, where does this come from, we started asking, what is this actually made of? Which, as we've seen, is still a big question in social ontology today.
It's like instead of just tracing the family tree, we're now looking at the DNA of these social things.
That's a great way to put it. And, speaking of fundamental questions, one of the ongoing challenges in social ontology is figuring out what counts as social in the first place. What's the boundary between the social and the non-social? Psychologistic theories, as we talked about, draw a pretty clear line. If it's not reducible to individual mental states, it's not social. But not everyone agrees with that.
Yeah, it seems kind of tricky, right? Like, is a traffic jam social? It's definitely caused by people, but is there something inherently social about the jam itself? Or is it just, a bunch of cars in the same place at the same time?
Exactly. And there's also debate about whether certain things that we think are social are actually social in a robust sense. Take crowds, for example. Back in the late 19th century, crowds were seen as a prime example of a social entity, the mob mentality and all that. But now, some philosophers, like Margaret Gilbert, argue that a mere gathering of people doesn't necessarily constitute true sociality. For Gilbert, genuine sociality involves shared norms, commitments, maybe even a joint intention to act as a group. So a flash mob might not be social in the same way that, say, a long-standing book club is.
Interesting. So more recently, have there been any attempts to pin down what we mean by social or socially constructed?
Oh, absolutely. There's been a lot of work on this lately. Some philosophers, like Mason and Khalidi, argue that social kinds depend on certain types of mental states. Others, like Schaeffer and Griffith, offer these grounding theoretic accounts, which suggest that something is socially constructed if its existence or nature is at least partly grounded in social features or patterns.
Hmm.
So, like a government-issued currency is socially constructed because its value is grounded in our shared beliefs and practices.
Right, that makes sense. And I guess there's also the question of which kinds of social entities are the most fundamental, right?
Absolutely. Some theories focus on social laws, others on social facts, social groups, humankinds, institutions, practices, processes. It's a bit like trying to figure out what the most basic ingredients of a cake are. Is it the flour, the sugar, the eggs?
And I guess one of the most fundamental questions of all is, are individuals themselves socially constructed?
That's a big one. Are we, at our core, just individuals who happen to live in a social world? Or are our very identities, our values, our ways of thinking and being, are these shaped in fundamental ways by our social interactions? It's a question that gets to the heart of what it means to be human.
Wow, that's deep. It really blurs the lines between the individual and the collective.
It does. And all this leads to another big debate in social ontology, realism versus anti-realism about the social.
Okay, now this is where things start to get really meta.
It does get a little heady. Basically, the question is, are social entities real in the same way that, say, a rock is real? Or are they somehow less real, more ephemeral, because they depend on our minds or our social practices?
Yeah, it's a common intuition, right? That something we've created socially is somehow less solid than something that exists independently of us.
It is. But a lot of recent philosophical work has tried to challenge this idea. Critical realism, for example, argues that even though social entities arise from social interactions, they can still possess real causal powers. They can have real effects in the world.
So, a corporation is created by people, but once it exists, it can act on its own, so to speak.
Right. It can influence markets, shape the environment, even affect the course of history. And some philosophers go even further, arguing that mind dependence doesn't necessarily imply anti-realism. They say that social entities can be both real and mind-dependent.
Okay, that's a bit mind-bending, but it makes you think about, how we define real in the first place.
Exactly. And this connects to debates in metaphysics about the reality of everyday objects, too. If we can question the ultimate reality of a table or a chair, then it's not such a big leap to question the reality of, say, a nation-state or a legal system.
So we're not just questioning the reality of the social world, we're questioning the reality of the whole world.
We are. And, speaking of different perspectives, another key debate in social ontology is between individualism and holism. We touched on individualism earlier, the idea that the social is built from individuals. Holism, on the other hand, argues that social entities are sui generis, meaning they exist as something fundamentally new and distinct, not just as collections of individuals. So the social whole is more than just the sum of its parts.
Okay, so holism is like saying that society has its own kind of reality, a reality that shapes and constrains individuals.
Right. Think of it like the rules of a game. The rules aren't just the sum of what each individual player wants to do. They exist as a separate structure that shapes how everyone plays the game. And more recently, you have these even more radical perspectives like flat ontologies. These theories reject any kind of hierarchy between different types of entities. They say that everything, atoms, people, machines, institutions, it's all on the same level, connected in complex networks and assemblages.
That's a pretty wild way of looking at things. So it's like the social isn't a separate realm, it's just one part of this big, messy web of interconnected things.
That's the idea.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the basic building blocks of social entities to the construction of social categories to these really big picture debates about realism and holism. Now, how can we apply all this to specific things in the social world? How does social ontology help us understand, say, social groups or institutions, or even things like race and gender?
Great question. Social ontology provides us with a really powerful lens for analyzing all sorts of social phenomena. Let's start with social groups.
Okay, so what can social ontology tell us about, say, a sports team or a family or a nation?
Well, one of the first things social ontology asks is, what are these things? Are they just sets of individuals? If so, how do we account for the fact that groups can persist even when their members change? A football team can have a totally different roster from one year to the next, but we still consider it the same team.
Yeah, that's
So, some theories suggest that groups are defined by certain roles or relationships rather than by specific individuals. Others propose that groups are like fusions of people, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But that raises tricky questions like whether a person's hair is part of the group if the person is. And then you have cases of coinciding groups, where you have the exact same members but different purposes. Think about your neighborhood association versus a casual poker night with your neighbors, same people, different group.
so even with something as seemingly straightforward as a group, there's a lot of philosophical complexity.
There is. And this complexity gets even more, well, complex when we start thinking about collective responsibility.
Mm,
Can a group, as an entity, be held morally responsible for actions? Or is it only the individual members who are responsible?
that's a tough one.
It is. And it's closely tied to the debate on group minds and group agency. Can groups have intentions, beliefs, desires? Can they make decisions and act in a unified way, similar to how individuals do? Some philosophers, drawing on functionalist approaches, argue that they can. They see groups as systems with distributed cognitive functions. But this view faces challenges, especially around whether groups can have subjective experiences or feelings. Analyzing complex groups like corporations with their intricate decision-making structures is a really interesting area here.
It makes you wonder if it even makes sense to say, like, the company decided to do X as if the company were a single unified agent.
Exactly. Now, moving on to institutions, organizations, and firms, social ontology offers a lot of insights here, too. We can connect this back to economics and the work of someone like Ronald Coase, who famously asked, "Why do firms even exist?" His answer was that firms exist to reduce the costs of transactions. But social ontology digs deeper, asking, what is the ontological status of a firm? Is it a real thing in itself, or is it just a convenient fiction, a nexus of contracts, as some legal theorists put it?
So it's like asking, is a company a real thing or just a bunch of agreements on paper?
Exactly. And there are questions about what role things like property rights, shared resources, and established practices play in defining these entities. Theories of firms often grapple with issues of boundaries, why one firm ends and another begins, and how firms can sometimes be more efficient than open markets.
It's interesting to see how these, like, abstract philosophical ideas can have real-world implications for how we think about businesses and the economy.
They do. And then we get into areas with even more, well, let's say social and political weight. Things like race, gender, and disability. Social ontology takes a critical look at these categories, questioning their supposed naturalness or inevitability. It often reveals what some philosophers call their darker underpinnings, the hidden power dynamics and social forces that have shaped them over time.
It's like saying, hey, wait a minute, are these categories really just given, or are they products of specific social and historical contexts?
Exactly. And a key theme here is the rejection of biological essentialism. Take gender, for instance. Many social ontologists argue that gender is a socially constructed category of norms, behaviors, and expectations that are often, but not always, linked to biological sex. But even the idea of sex as purely biological is debated. The concept of intersectionality further complicates things, showing how these different categories can overlap and interact to shape people's lived experiences.
So it's not just about understanding how these categories were constructed, it's also about recognizing the power dynamics and inequalities that they often perpetuate.
Right. And some philosophers, like Sally Haslanger, advocate for what's called ameliorative analysis, which suggests that social ontology can play an active role in rethinking and reimagining these categories with the goal of creating a more just and equitable world.
It's like, instead of just describing the social world, we can use social ontology to try and change it for the better.
Precisely. And what about artifacts and artworks? How does social ontology help us understand them?
That's an interesting one.
Well, one of the big questions is, what makes something an artifact in the first place? Is it the intention behind its creation, its intended function, its historical context, its relationship to human practices, and how do we distinguish between different kinds of artifacts?
Yeah, like, is a smartphone just an object with a purpose, or does its social and cultural significance make it something more?
That's exactly the kind of questions social ontology explores. This also connects to the ontology of art, which asks what kind of things artworks are, how we identify them, and how artistic categories themselves evolve.
Fascinating. So social ontology isn't just about abstract social structures. It can help us understand concrete objects, too.
Absolutely. What about money? Social ontology digs into the nature of money, going beyond just its economic functions. Historically, there were big debates about the gold standard, what gives money its value. Today, the focus is often on the ontology of electronic money and cryptocurrencies. What are these things? Are they just numbers in a computer? Or do they have some other kind of social reality?
Right,
Mm,
like, is a Bitcoin a physical object, a social agreement, a piece of code, or all of the above?
Precisely. Social ontology helps us untangle those questions. And finally, we come to the law, which is a really rich area for social ontology. It grapples with questions like, what determines the content of laws? Is it statutes, judicial interpretations, social practices, underlying moral principles? And what are the sources of law's authority? Why do we see laws as binding? This leads to debates between legal positivism and natural law theory.
And I guess social ontology also looks at the nature of legal entities themselves, like contracts, corporations, and so on.
Yes, and it can also have implications for how we make and interpret laws, especially in tricky areas like corporate liability or defining complex legal categories.
Wow, we've covered so much in this deep dive. It's amazing to see how social ontology touches on practically every aspect of our lives.
It really does. So to recap, we've seen how social ontology tackles two fundamental questions. What are social entities made of, and how are social categories constructed? We've explored a whole range of perspectives, from those that emphasize individual psychology to those that focus on social practices, patterns, and the power of language.
And what's really cool is that this isn't just some abstract philosophical exercise. Understanding social ontology can give us real insights into the world around us.
It can. By engaging with these ideas, we can start to see the hidden structures and assumptions that shape our social realities. Things that we might take for granted, things that seem natural or inevitable often, they turn out to be products of complex social processes and agreements.
So, to our listeners out there, here's a challenge for you. Think about some social category that you encounter in your daily life. Maybe it's something like friend, citizen, criminal, artist. Now, try to look at that category through the lens of social ontology. What are its potential building blocks? How might it have been constructed? And how does it shape your own experiences and interactions? By asking these questions, you can start to see your everyday world in a whole new light.
And remember, this deep dive is just a starting point. If you're intrigued by any of the ideas we've discussed, I encourage you to check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on social ontology. It's a fantastic resource with tons of in-depth information and further reading suggestions. And of course, there's a whole world of philosophical writing out there just waiting to be explored.
So keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep exploring. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.